Welcome back. One of the things that we're all concerned about, what's happening with the law and the integrity of the law and the interpretation of the law. It's been in the news a lot, especially with lawfare and everything else going on. So a lot of questions out there. Why does the court reject certain cases, rule the way that it does? Well, we have a professional with us today. Anastasia Boden is with us, civil rights attorney for the Pacific Legal Foundation, where she focuses on economic opportunity and equality before the law, or before the law. Anyway, I can't say enough about Pacific Legal Foundation. Great organization doing great work in your behalf. These are frontline warriors, and they do an amazing job. You can go to pacificlegal.org and check out a lot of things that they're doing and the cases that they're involved in. And I have high regard for them. Anastasia, good to see you. How are you today?
Hi, thanks for having me. Doing well.
Yeah, doing well. Wow, lots to talk to you about. Just trying to get our brain around some of the things that are going on. Let's start with President Trump asked the court to suspend or stay his sentencing, and that was rejected. What's your interpretation of that?
Yeah, well, it was really interesting because the court split with Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Barrett joining the so-called liberal justices in rejecting Trump's request. He had asked the court to suspend his sentencing, as you said, and based probably on the fact that that judge in that case had said that he wasn't going to give Trump any jail time anyway. I think the conservatives thought, at least Justice Roberts and Justice Barrett thought, well, there's really no need for us to step in. And so they joined the liberals in voting that way. And this blew the Supreme Court's critics' minds, of course, because they always assume that the justices vote in lockstep with the political party that nominated them to the bench. And I thought it was a really good indicator and a good warning to people that law is much more complicated and nuanced than bare partisan politics. We really need to stop criticizing the justices based solely on or assuming that they vote along political lines and instead evaluate them fairly. Because we're doing real injustice and detriment to the court when we talk about the justices in pure political terms.
One of the criticisms that came out of that was that Judge Michon, pre-announcing his sentencing, might have set the court up for that decision. Was that a factor?
Yes, it may very well have been. You know, courts are courts of equity, and I think it's fair for them to consider the fact that the court really needed to jump in immediately, sort of on an emergency basis when they have a limited docket. They only take so many cases a year. Their jurisdiction is narrow. Their purpose is narrow. It's really not to just correct necessarily bad decisions, but it's to set precedent that affects the entire nation. And so I think the fact that the lower court had said, hey, I'm not giving jail time anyway, I do think that perhaps factored into the justices' minds when making their decision. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's just the way that that law sort of plays out. Okay, so do you have any idea how that case in the end ends up? I mean, the case in New York against the president. I mean, will it go to appeal? What happens here? You know, I'm not sure, especially given that the end result is that there is no real meaningful sentence for President Trump at this time. Life goes on. It's not really affecting him. So I think we'll have to see what his team of attorneys decides to do. Okay, but he is convicted, so he'd like to get that removed. He would, but you can imagine, I don't know, I'm no politician. I stick purely to constitutional law, but you can imagine, you know, law is not easy. It also politically will bring more attention to that case. We'll have to rehash it all over again. It's not good for his image to have to go through that. At least that's what I would be saying to my client in a legal case, that you have to consider not just the sort of legal terms, but also, do you yourself want to continue going through this and fighting it, and what's it going to do for your life and your reputation? So let's go over to the TikTok case. What did the Supreme Court see in the TikTok case that will enable them to jump over the First Amendment rights and see it as national security? Yeah, this was a really interesting case, especially because it happened so quickly. The Supreme Court had decided to hear the court on an emergency basis because the ban was set to go in effect mid-January. So it scheduled a special argument in early January to hear whether the congressional law, which said that TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, which is based in China, that company either had to divest of TikTok or TikTok had to stop operating in the U.S. the court wanted to decide whether that violated the First Amendment rights of not only TikTok, but the content creators who post stuff on TikTok. And ultimately, I think because it was deciding on a really short-term basis, and because the United States invoked some pretty serious national security concerns, the Supreme Court wrote a very narrow decision saying, look, we don't know about how technology is going to play out in the future, and this was all decided really quickly, but at least for now, we're going to uphold the ban. And that's because the United States had said that there is a Chinese law that would require ByteDance to hand over all of its information and control to China if China asked it to do so. And the U.S. was concerned that China would then use all of that data, because there is, after all, 170 million U.S. TikTok users. And China would use that data to recruit spies, to access the location of sensitive people or things related to national security. It could blackmail people. There's all sorts of uses that China could have with that information. And the court said, you know, that's probably good enough. We're not going to stop this law. It did caution the government not to take its decision as a blank check that would now allow the government to go banning companies right and left, or to expand this social media law. But ultimately, it did let this law go, as I said, in a very narrow opinion that rejected some of the other of the government's arguments that were more related to censoring speech. It said, hey, we're not going to let you censor speech necessarily, but we will allow you to regulate the control of ByteDance, since that implicates the national security concerns.
So in the end, because all social media harvests information, but TikTok's harvest of information then became the property of China, which is a foreign agent at that point, which would be harmful to the United States. Is that kind of the bottom line?
That is essentially TikTok and some of the content creators had said in this case exactly what you're saying. Hey, a lot of social media companies, and not even social media companies, all companies, I mean, online shopping companies, they all harvest your data. And so it's not really fair for you to single out TikTok. And in fact, it undermines the government's argument that this is all about national security if they're not going to target other companies, and Chinese companies, in fact, that harvest your data. But the government said, and the Supreme Court agreed, that TikTok is special. TikTok is different, and that's because it harvests even more information than most other companies. I mean, biometric information, keystrokes, your contacts potentially. And so there was something really about TikTok in particular, and the fact, of course, that TikTok was subject to Chinese law, not just like all foreign companies, and that the Chinese law would allow China to have access and control over this company, that made TikTok special. And so even though, you know, I think there are serious privacy concerns related to all of our use of the internet, the court said that here there was enough evidence that TikTok was really special to justify the law.
So at the end, TikTok is foreign intrusion.
Well, that's the interesting part, is that TikTok had said, hey, there's no evidence that China has actually ever requested this data or that we have turned any data over. And the Supreme Court said, well, do we really have to wait until that happens? Are we supposed to wait until China all of a sudden has all of this information on 170 million United States citizens before the government steps in? And so there was a fight about whether there had been intrusion in the past and whether China even will engage in that intrusion in the future. But basically the court said, hey, we don't have to wait for that to happen. It's okay for the government to step in now to prevent that from happening.
So Anastasia, where does that leave Facebook, Instagram, and X?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is we don't even know, even though the Supreme Court had upheld this law, when President Trump came into office, he immediately issued an executive order that suspended the congressional law and gave ByteDance more time to divest so TikTok wouldn't have to stop operating. And we'll see if something comes out of that. I mean, it's possible that even Congress repeals the law. We don't really know what's going to happen with it. So even TikTok is back up and operating. And in fact, you know, this law might go away anyway because of, you know, the pressure of the the millions of Americans who were deeply disappointed in the Supreme Court's decision in the congressional law. So even for TikTok, we don't know the fate. It might be okay. As for other companies, like I said, the Supreme Court did write its decision really narrowly and kind of warned the government, hey, don't go expanding this too quickly. You're going to need a lot of evidence to justify it in the future. So for now, it seems like those companies are safe, but we'll have to see if this becomes a slippery slope for regulation of social media.
Okay, just a couple more quick questions on that. Justice Sotomayor's response was interesting, and then you look over at Justice Gorsuch, and he was concerned about the scrutiny and government secrecy violations. Quite the dichotomy there. Can you enlighten us a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. This was all in all a unanimous and an unsigned opinion, but Justice Sotomayor and Justice Gorsuch, as you said, wrote separately. That's because Justice Sotomayor wanted to underline the fact that she thought there were serious First Amendment concerns here. She did, of course, think that the government overcame them, but in the Supreme Court's decision, they had said, hey, this really isn't about censoring speech. It's about control of companies that are operating in the U.S. And Justice Sotomayor said, come on, that's not what's really going on. This is obviously a First Amendment concern, and so I don't want, the court to step around that or ignore that. So that was her concern. Justice Gorsuch wrote separately to say, because as I said, it was a very quick decision, a very short decision, and he sort of elaborated on the rest of it. And he said, I'm really glad the court here ignored some of the government's other justifications for the law. It basically just ignored them altogether. The government had come into court saying, we're also concerned China's going to use TikTok for propaganda purposes. And the court had just kind of ignored that and said, well, the other concerns related to espionage are good enough. And Justice Gorsuch said, I'm glad that the court has effectively rejected that propaganda concern, because that feels more censorial. It feels more like a First Amendment violation. He also wrote to say that the government had handed over a lot of evidence, and it had effectively blocked TikTok and the other plaintiffs from looking at that evidence. And the court ended up upholding the law without even looking at or addressing that evidence. And Justice Gorsuch said that's a good thing for rule of law. This law can be upheld without having to resort to secret procedures and secret evidence that really implicates due process concerns. And then, of course, the last part was him saying, a lot of the fight in constitutional law and in this case was about how hard the justices should look at the law. That is, what type of judicial scrutiny they should give to the law. Because lawyers are always trying to fit laws into certain boxes, because certain boxes get you more judicial scrutiny. And he said sometimes this fight about what box, is it First Amendment? Is it this amendment? What really is the interest here? He said this fight takes away from the real concern, which should be, is the law justified on the merits? So it was kind of a critique of our constitutional system as it is, which focuses a lot on tiers of scrutiny rather than the merits of a law.
A lot there. So where is TikTok today as a result of this case? What condition is it in?
Yeah, well, it did temporarily shut down after the Supreme Court's decision was released in anticipation of the ban going into effect. But at the time, President-elect Trump promised to extend the deadline, and evidently he was able to give enough of a promise to reassure TikTok that it would not be prosecuted or that it would have no consequence if it continued operating despite the ban. And so it immediately, I think within less than 24 hours, came back online to the relief of, Generation Z Americans everywhere. And Trump did, in fact, issue that executive order, which now extends the deadline for 75 days. And that will give ByteDance more breathing room, more time to divest of TikTok to comply with the law, or to potentially, haggle with the United States government or lobby Congress to get the law off the books.
All this, and it's still there. I guess what's so interesting about this, because there's been talk about it being sold, and I don't know, does that solve anything really?
If it's sold to a non-Chinese company, then at least you're not having a parent company that is subject to a law in China that would require that company to hand over the data to the Chinese government. TikTok has maintained throughout litigation that it's basically impossible for its parent company to divest because it's going to lose access to the algorithm. And the algorithm, of course, is the most important part of TikTok. It's what makes TikTok so addicting, right? Is that it plays to your interest, it predicts your interest. And also the fact that TikTok would lose access to all of ByteDance's other subsidiaries' information. Basically, it said, hey, if you make us divest, we really can't operate anymore. But, the United States has said, we think that's just some gamesmanship, and if it's really, if its feet are held to the fire, it will in fact divest to a non-Chinese company, and it will be able to operate perfectly fine. So we'll kind of see what ends up happening there.
I can't help but think that if it is sold, that deal would be looked at so carefully to make sure that there is no pending agreement still connected to China.
That's right. And that was actually part of the law. It said, even after you divest of TikTok, you can't even collaborate with TikTok. ByteDance cannot collaborate with TikTok on the algorithm or anything like that. And TikTok had said, hey, that's really unfair. Now you're saying even if you sell, even if ByteDance sells, we can't collaborate with them. And the Supreme Court and the United States government said, of course, that's the entire point. When you collaborate on the algorithm, that's when all of this data and information is being traded between the companies. And so we can't just allow ByteDance to make promises about exchanging this information or do anything else. We have to put up this full-on block that says not only can you not own TikTok, but you cannot collaborate on the algorithm in any way, because that's the only way that the United States government can effectuate its interests.
So sorry, I got one more quick question. So with that decision, doesn't that kind of devalue TikTok from being sold? Because if you can't get the algorithms with the deal, then hey, what good is the company? And then therefore it has to go away because it's foreign intrusion.
Yeah, that's interesting. As a business matter, I'm sure it does reduce the price of TikTok, and perhaps that's why, ByteDance is fighting this so hard. But, that is the case with many regulations. I present business owners all the time whose business is devalued by government regulation. Of course, in my cases, I think it's much more clear, at least, that the laws are unfair and unconstitutional. But that's the nature of government regulation.
Oh, wonderful. All right, let me take a quick break. Go to pacificlegal.org. That's Anastasia's website there with the Pacific Legal Foundation, an outstanding organization fighting in your behalf. There's a picture of the landing page, pacificlegal.org. We got some more questions for her. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. What an honor to have with us today Anastasia Boden. She is a civil rights attorney at the Pacific Legal Foundation, outstanding organization working in your behalf. She focuses on economic opportunity and equality before the law. And we're talking to her about an array of things. By the way, you can go to pacificlegal.org and check out all the cases. Anastasia and her team watch what's going on at the Supreme Court, and they just do a great job. Thank you for your time. Again, thank you. We value it greatly. Do you expect President Trump's executive order that got challenged, I think, by 26 or 27 states to do away with the birthright citizenship will make its way to the Supreme Court?
I think almost certainly this will go to the Supreme Court. It's already been challenged, as you said, by a number of states and by immigrants' rights groups. And a district court judge has enjoined the order, which means right now the order is not into effect. I expect that, Trump ran on this. It was a very big issue in the election. I expect he intends to appeal that all the way up to the Supreme Court. And given, the national implications and the fact that this concerns the 14th Amendment and the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment, which the Supreme Court has not had many occasions to interpret, I think the Supreme Court will feel it's very important to take up this case and to decide whether his executive order is constitutional.
What part of the 14th Amendment would be vulnerable to this executive order?
So this executive order implicates the Citizenship Clause. That's the first clause of the 14th Amendment. And it was one of the primary intentions of the 14th Amendment, which of course was enacted after the Civil War. In the wake of the Civil War, the Congress at that time sought to ensure and protect the rights of recently freed slaves, as well as Black Americans generally, But the amendment is written in broad terms so that it protects everyone. It's not limited to people of any one race. But in any event, the background is that the Supreme Court had recently decided at that time the Dred Scott decision, which most of us know and have heard of at some time because we know what a terrible decision that was. And it ruled that Dred Scott was not a citizen merely because of his race. And because of that, he could not sue for his freedom. And so after the Civil War, the Reconstruction Congress included a citizenship clause, which said people born in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are entitled to citizenship. It's been widely interpreted as broadly granting birthright citizenship. But of course, it does not give birthright citizenship to everyone born in the U.S. Otherwise, it would have just said everyone born in the U.S. Instead, it says everyone born in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And so the question is, what does that mean? Does it include non-citizens, people who are here illegally and perhaps temporarily? Are they entitled to citizenship? Are they subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S.? And that's a legal term of art, and we'll have to see if the Supreme Court thinks that it interprets illegal non-citizens or non-citizens who are here temporarily.
A lot of countries have done away with it for the various reasons that we're talking about here. So the child would be a citizen, but not necessarily the parents. Is that where the abuse came in?
So you're right that even if you have birthright citizenship here, that does not mean the parent has citizenship. I think what people were concerned about and where the impetus behind this executive order came in is that because birthright citizenship has been interpreted so broadly, people view it as incentivizing non-citizens to come here illegally and then to give birth, to give their children citizenship. And so because of that, there's this executive order saying, hey, we don't actually think they're entitled to citizenship because they are not subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Now, the Supreme Court has said in a previous Supreme Court decision that some non-citizens, at least, when they give birth, those children are entitled to citizenship. But in that case, the non-citizens were here permanently and they were here legally. And so proponents of this executive order say, hey, that case is distinguishable. It says nothing about people who are here illegally and non-permanently. And we'll have to see if the Supreme Court thinks that that's a distinction with a difference, or if it thinks that the citizenship clause is quite broad and applies to non-citizens even if they're here illegally and non-permanently.
So I can't help but think the court's going to pick this up.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's true. It's really interesting because, you know, even within the first few days of Trump's presidency, there's been a flurry of executive orders, and I think many of them are going to make their way up to the Supreme Court. It's really interesting time for constitutional law, and especially given that the district court in this case already enjoined an executive order, which is a very big move to do, right? It's something that affects the entire country. I think that it's possible that this case could actually be fast-tracked to the Supreme Court.
Back to our original question at the very beginning, the concerns over partisanship within the court. On something like this where it would interpret an amendment to the Constitution, do you think that'll be a factor?
You know, I never think it's a factor. I think having studied constitutional law for some time, I just understand how nuanced it is, and that some of these things, even if they have political overtones, the legal issues themselves are not political. They take a great deal of scholarship. They rely on meaningful scholarship, and the court often splits along non-party lines. We often see, you know, they like to say at the Supreme Court that you find interesting bedfellows where you have Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kagan joining together, or you have Justice Jackson even joining the conservatives on certain issues. So I think that nothing is certain, and it's hard to make a prediction in this case.
All right, good stuff. Anastasia, thank you for your time. Thank you for what you and your organization do. This is going to be an interesting one to watch because this is a biggie. This is an amendment to the Constitution, so we'll see how it goes. It's obviously been abused, and whether or not it can be tightened up, we'll have to wait and see, I guess.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, let me say to our viewers and listeners, go to pacificlegal.org. That's the website. There's the picture of the landing page, pacificlegal.org. By the way, support them. They do great work in your behalf. We'll see you next time on Focus Today. Thank you, Anastasia.